All right, hey everybody. Mansueto Colloquium. We're really pleased to have one of our own postdocs, Lydia Wileden, presenting to us today. Lydia is a second-year postdoc at Mansueto. She came to us after completing her PhD in sociology at the University of Michigan. Her work focuses on collecting and utilizing unique survey data to understand and model how people make sense and make decisions about their local environments. Her research agenda examines the ways neighborhood knowledge, imperfect information, perceptions, place reputations, demographic change, and public policy combine to shape where and how we live. And I always get to learn something new about somebody when I get to introduce them. So I learned that Lydia, in fact, worked for Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi and for Neighborhood Works America and received her BA in Urban Studies from Barnard. And so we're really pleased to have Lydia both here as our postdoc and also as our speaker for today. And I'm going to ask you to save your questions to the end of the talk. If you have a clarifying question, feel free to ask that during the talk. Otherwise, we have a Q&A period set aside at the end. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks, everyone. There's a couple of seats up front if anybody feels stuck in the back. All right. So I'm just turning on my timer so I don't, so keep myself honest. Okay, so thank you all for coming today. This is, I think, a little bit unprecedented in terms of the scale of attendance, which is exciting and terrifying.
Yep.
And thank you, Chris, for that introduction. Thank you, Amy, for helping get all these bodies into this room. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you all a little bit about an ongoing research project that we call the Chicago Neighborhood Project. So before I begin, I want to just recognize my research collaborators who are the real brains and brawn of this operation. We would be nowhere without Dr. Emily Talon, who is my mentor here at Mansueto and is one of the most generative researchers that I have ever had the pleasure to work with. And then, of course, our geodata whiz, Crystal Bay, who really helps with all of the geographic mapping that is really the backbone of this project. And then we're supported by an amazing team of students, some of whom are here, as well as our web developer. That's a special shout out. And then I just want to acknowledge that our project was funded by the Mansueto Institute, specifically the Mansueto Urban Innovation Grant Fund. I think the grant cycle is currently open. Applications due March 1st, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, well, or fake news, I don't know. So any aspiring researchers, consider applying. And then I think all good talks start with a healthy number of disclaimers. So the first is that the data that we're going to share today and the findings are preliminary. The survey is open. We are actively continuing to collect data and trying to correct some of the biases that we'll discuss later on. So you know that everything I show you is bound to change. And then the second is I'm a sociologist. I need to acknowledge my positionality within this research team, and specifically the irony, which is that we're going to be critiquing a little bit the creation of the community areas by sociologists at the University of Chicago. I'm a sociologist at the University of Chicago. I'm in on the joke that we're trying to correct something that other sociologists who greatly preceded me created. But yeah, so while the goal of this project is really to collect information from Chicago residents, inevitably it all passes through a research filter, and I am that research filter. So I want to acknowledge that at the beginning. All right. So just a quick overview of what I'm hoping to cover today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Chicago's community areas, where they came from, how they were defined, how they get used, and what might be gained by updating them. And I'm going to use that to sort of motivate why we launched this project. Then I'm going to talk to you about the actual launch of that project, how we designed it, how we rolled it out, what the response has been, both numbers and then also sort of the effective response to the survey and some feedback that we've received. And then I'm going to dive into some research findings, both potential research questions that we are hoping to answer in both academic articles and products that we'll make available to the public. And then show you some very brief bites of two of those research projects. One, trying to understand how residents' drawn boundaries align with administrative boundaries, and then another trying to model the variation in drawn neighborhood scale. So hopefully we will make it through all of that today. Okay, so to start, as an urban researcher who is relatively new to the city of Chicago, but I've studied Chicago for a long time, I want to say that the community areas really hold a special place in my heart. Every day in my research, I am asking, how do we best measure places, and bumping up against the frustration of changing geographic boundaries, right? The utility of creating these spatial boundaries that are complete, meaning they cover the whole city. I'll talk about the pizza in a second, and unchanging over time is really not lost on me. But then beyond just the utility of the community areas and this way of breaking up Chicago into distinct geographies, something I've really come to appreciate since moving here is the ubiquity of the community areas. And I'm going to illustrate that by entering this exhibit into evidence. When I moved to Chicago, I received this postcard from a friendly realtor welcoming me to the city. And if you are not familiar with the city, you might say, like, oh, it's pizza, deep dish, or tavern style. That's lovely. It's in Chicago. But to the trained eye, this is a map of the community areas. So if that doesn't show you that the community areas are a relatively ubiquitous presence in how we think about Chicago, I don't know what does. But so where did these community areas come from? They are the brainchild of this man. This is Ernest Burgess. He and his colleagues at the Social Science Research Committee right here at the University of Chicago created the community areas back in the 1920s. Back then, Burgess and his mentor, Robert Park, and numerous other colleagues were in the process of creating what we now come to think of as the Chicago School of Sociology. They were actively trying to develop a new field of social science that really took the city as their laboratory. And Burgess personally spent a decade meticulously mapping the city. So he was talking about those efforts back in the 60s and said that they were really impressed with all the differences that they saw between various neighborhoods in the city. And so one of his goals was to try to find a pattern to make this patchwork of differences make sense. And so Burgess and his students drew these incredible maps. This is a map of manic depressives in the city of Chicago. This is a map of the different types of retail outlets in the central business district down in the Loop. These are all in the University of Chicago library, so you can actually go and see them. It's an incredible archival source. But so, Ernest Burgess was really actively thinking about how do we make the city make sense? How do we best measure it? And he and his colleagues recognized that boundaries like the wards, that the census used, and other political subdivisions were really insufficient for this purpose of trying to measure the city. They could be redrawn over time, so they were inconsistent, and they didn't correspond with how people thought of their communities. And so instead, they decided to try to create the community areas based on this idea that there are physical barriers like rivers and parks and railroads that help define what they think of as natural spaces within the city. So the goal was to create new boundaries that would reflect real, not arbitrary divisions within the city. So they were trying to improve upon what they thought were arbitrary geographies, which ironically is our own motivation about a century later. And so initially, Burgess sent out a team of researchers to sort of talk with lots of people, and they whittled down from a list of about 400 neighborhoods that they identified down to 80, and then eventually down to 75. So this is the map of the community area almost as Burgess created it. There have been two changes. The first is splitting Uptown and Edgewater up in the sort of far northern reaches of the city, and then adding O'Hare. So those changes happened, I believe, in the 1950s. But really, since Burgess created this map in the 1920s, this has been a fairly static depiction of Chicago. And it is recognized by the city as an official form of boundaries. It's used for statistical purposes, for planning purposes. It does not align with the wards almost at all. If you've looked at a ward map of Chicago, it'll boggle your mind about the gerrymandering, but that's not the topic of today.
Could you say that again?
Nope. So, okay, this is an interesting map. What's the problem? These community areas are big. They're almost 3 square miles on average, which is just really much larger than we generally think of as a typical neighborhood. And in the creation of these community areas, Burgess was sort of folding areas together. And so he ended up creating some like really behemoth neighborhoods that we maybe don't recognize anymore. We have New City over here, the near West Side. So he was in the process of trying to simplify, collapsing a lot of variability down into these large bites. And I also want to say that they were created at a very specific moment in time, right? So they might not reflect the neighborhood realities that we know today. We're not the only people to think this. There have been multiple other efforts to map the neighborhoods. This is a map trying to display the community areas as they exist, and then overlaying that with a map of the Chicago's neighborhoods, which was created in the 1970s. The city planning department basically said, we know that this doesn't really match what people think, so we're going to create another map with 228 neighborhoods, created in the 70s in part by surveying about 10 people per neighborhood, so a relatively small amount of feedback, and not actually recognized by the city council until 1994, but not used for anything official. So we have these overlapping understandings of neighborhoods and community areas. Zoom in a little bit and see Hyde Park and all of the different neighborhoods, right? We have East Hyde Park on the neighborhoods map, not on the community areas map. Bronzeville is not a named area on the community areas map, but is a very historically relevant neighborhood within Black history in Chicago. So there are things that are missing on the community areas map that we think is problematic. It's problematic for planning. It's problematic for how we talk about places. So we have a handful of motivations for this project, right? The first is community areas are old, possibly outdated. They have a lot of utility for measuring places consistently over time. But when they were created to try to match how people think about the city. So if we want to sort of think about, hold that part up, our project is sort of trying to replicate that motivation. They also reflect Ernest Burgess's decision-making and not necessarily the way that Chicagoans experienced the city. As Dr. Talon would point out, they don't adhere to some principles of urbanism about what constitutes a livable, walkable place with a clear geographic center. And then sort of tipping my hat to sociologists and the neighborhood effects folks in the room, they are really an exemplifying example of some of the simplifying assumptions that we make when we use administrative boundaries to think about how place affects how people experience neighborhoods, and then also the downstream effects of living in a place. So this is a lot of text. I'm gonna highlight different parts of it for you. This idea that the use of administrative boundaries is possibly problematic in how we study neighborhoods, I think is really clearly stated by Colton in a paper that she wrote in 2013. So just to highlight a couple of points that she's trying to make in this paragraph, she's saying the research on neighborhood effects has been growing recently, as has this focus on place-based investments. But a lot of these community initiatives are geared towards making improvements that in part use some simplifying assumptions about boundaries, right? We rely on census geography or political jurisdictions to operationalize the idea of a neighborhood. She points out that theories about how neighborhoods affect residents are seldom simple. So we're making these simplifying arguments about what context should matter, but our sort of theory about how those contexts matter really is quite complicated. So her argument is that to really understand the ways in which neighborhoods influence people, we have to understand how people actually think about their neighborhoods, the scale at which neighborhoods become relevant to us, and recognizing that my idea of a neighborhood might not be the same as Crystal's idea of a neighborhood. And her argument is that if we don't do this, we're making measurement errors, we're misspecifying our models. There's a whole lot of practical problems that can come up or can arise by equating the wrong conditions to influencing individual outcomes. Okay, so we took all of that motivation and we decided to launch what we call the Chicago Neighborhood Project. So this is the webpage that we designed. The Chicago Neighborhood Project was in part motivated by the New York Times launching a very similar mapping project where they invited their readers to map the city of New York and the neighborhoods that they were familiar with in New York. We saw about 37,000 New Yorkers complete that survey and said, let's try it here, with a little bit of motivation specifically about addressing the community areas. And so we decided that because one of our critiques was that Burgess kind of went rogue and did it himself, that what we really want is to collect as many responses as possible from Chicago residents. And so we want to have them to try to create a map or maps that reflect the messy and complicated perspectives of as many Chicago residents as possible. I come from some more typical survey research background where we do an address-based probability sample. We take everyone's address, we select people out of the full population, we send them letters saying, please do our survey. We get a relatively low response. So we're very familiar with that method of collecting data. And in this case, we thought, for the money and the time, let's try something a little bit different. So the survey tool, as I said, it's on the web. I want to point out that we've translated it into the 4 most common languages spoken in Chicago. So you could take it in English, Spanish, Mandarin, and Polish. Translating to Polish was really fun. My Polish is non-existent. So, and then because we don't have a lot of resources, we decided to have an incentive where we draw people's email addresses and send them a $50 gift card. And yeah, we sent out about 20 gift cards. All right. So the survey is relatively simple. We tried to keep it, given that we don't have much of an incentive for people to take it, that we wanted it to be fun and fast. There's really only 5 steps to it, and we tried to minimize the text as much as possible on the actual website. So you consent to the survey, you drop a pin identifying the general location of your home. We try to be really explicit that you don't need to be very specific about where that is. In my experience, actually fielding this with some folks at a housing event a couple weekends ago, they like zoomed in all the way so they could see their garage. So well, we are worried about personally identifiable information. Apparently a lot of users are not. And then once you've dropped a pin, we ask you, what do you call your neighborhood? There's a drop-down list that we've populated, but we also accept any filled in answers, and you can leave it blank. And then we just say, now draw your neighborhood. We don't define what the neighborhood is that we're looking for. We don't have any parameters about what we're asking about. We can talk maybe in the Q&A about the fact that our consent page is all about community areas and what that might do to the data. But we are trying to be as ambiguous as possible in terms of what we mean by neighborhood to try to solicit from the residents themselves how they actually experience place. And then you are welcome at the end of this section to repeat this step for other neighborhoods. Almost nobody does this. And then you can go and tell us a little bit about your demographics. And you can break off at any point. So we actually capture data at each frame of the survey, which is good and bad. We can talk about that too. So how did we actually deploy the survey? We took this crowdsourced survey response approach. So we did kind of a multimodal, mostly online outreach effort. We started with some email outreach where we emailed about 225 community organizations. We've emailed the aldermen's offices to not very much avail. And we also sent emails to some of our professional contacts, specifically mostly Emily's professional contacts, as she's relatively well connected in the planning and policy making space. We bought Google ads. This is an example of one of the Google ads. We worked with an advertising agency, The Well, because my creative or my visual design chops are poor, as well as my Polish. And they helped us place Google ads. They also had us do some influencer campaigns on Instagram, which was a new method to me. We got a little bit of buzz on Twitter. I posted about it personally, and I was very surprised with my minimal following, what happened, including that we went viral on Reddit. All of these things might be suggesting a little bit of bias creeping in. We'll get there. And then we also got some media coverage. We were picked up by Block Club Chicago, Chicago Magazine. I'm forgetting a few at Cranes Chicago. I did a television appearance on Chicago Tonight Black Voices. So really media heavy, but sort of multimodal outreach. And then I should add that we are currently doing some direct outreach to communities that we feel are underrepresented. So we're working with the Survey Lab here at U Chicago to actually meet people in their neighborhoods where they are. I mentioned going to a housing event. So we are actively in the process of directly collecting data. This is just a graph of our responses over time. Kind of started hot. You can see when some media hit, and then it's been a little bit of a slow grind, especially since the holidays, as we're mostly at this point, we're really trying to correct for response bias. So we're taking a much more targeted approach. But as you can also see, this is just based on how many people made it all the way through to the demographics page. We have almost 5,000 people. So I mentioned people start the survey and break off. We have about 7,200 people who did that second step of dropping a pin to tell us where they live. And then in terms of the actual neighborhood drawings that were made, especially once we've cleaned out some unrealistic drawings, we end up with about 4,000 polygons that we're working with. Those come from 3,800 unique respondents who live in 1,200 different block groups in Chicago. and 632 census tracts. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of like, how does that compare to some other projects? I mentioned Claudia Colton earlier. She worked with the Annie Casey Foundation, and they did this similar mapping exercise back in 2003. So slightly different technology that they were using. And they collected out across 10 cities, about 6,000 maps. A similar study in Canada has collected 7,800 maps, but for the entire country. So, 4,000 maps of neighborhoods for a single city is actually pretty impressive.
Do you know how many maps the New York Times study collected?
They collected
We don't like
response.
to talk
yeah.
about it.
They collected responses from 37,000 people.
I see.
I was one of them. I don't live in New York anymore. I did a while ago. But so I think that they don't talk about the demographics of their response. I can tell you that in their mapping project, so they got 37,000 responses, 13% of Brooklyn was unmapped. 33% of the Bronx was unmapped, 55% of Staten Island. So they got a lot of people, but there's still a lot of area within the New York metropolitan area that they didn't end up mapping, even with such a big response. So this is where our respondents live. We'll talk a little bit about it. I mentioned that we went viral on Reddit. I think that you can see some places where our personal network extended to, and some areas where our personal network did not extend quite so well. This is Hyde Park. Quite a lot of responses there. But yeah, the obvious thing from this map is that we have a lot of responses from the north side and not as many responses from the south and west sides. This is an initial overview of what those 4,000 neighborhood drawings look like. Again, it sort of reinforces that we have a lot of perspectives about what's going on the north side and an agreement and disagreement there. A lot sparser in terms of maps down on the south side. I don't think that we've calculated the percent of Chicago that isn't covered by at least one map. I imagine that especially down here in South Deering, which is industrial, we probably have no responses. And you can also see, we're working on cleaning up. Who did that? That's not sure. That might have been me. We're also cleaning out like my testing of the data, but yeah, so that just gives you a taste. So what did people draw? People provided 466 distinct neighborhood names. That is, I will admit, not cleaned up. So if someone had a typo, I'm guessing that we'll probably end up with closer to like 300 distinct neighborhood names. 12% of people did not tell us a neighborhood name. About 5% drew Hyde Park. About 4% drew Logan Square, which is where I live, and hung some flyers. So, and then about 3% drew Lincoln Park. Some people also gave us other neighborhood names. One person told us that their neighborhood was called Unsafe. Another said, we don't have neighborhood. We don't, typo. We don't have a neighborhood. We're sandwiched between a bunch of others. So they don't have a neighborhood, but they drew a space. That's part of what we were trying to elicit, is this idea that you might not feel like your neighborhood is captured or represented, but in fact, you have a space that you identify as where you live, and that really matters. Okay, so I mentioned before we had this step where you could draw additional neighborhoods. Very few people took us up on that. So 92% of our drawings were of people's neighborhood of residence, which I think is good and bad. And then, we had fewer responses. We asked people if they were drawing a second geography, like what is this that you think you're drawing? How do you know about this place? And so this kind of captures some of that. I think that there's a certain level of validity that comes with drawing the place that you live, because ideally that is the place that you know best. But at least for some of my purposes, I'm really interested in how people not only think about where they live, but other parts of the city and how they kind of know when they've entered a different place. And so the data that we've collected probably doesn't really extend to that kind of analysis. So we gave people an opportunity to give us some feedback. These are ones that I liked. It's so exciting to see this interactive platform. I'm really glad you put this together. They've been thinking for years about how neighborhoods vary. This person said, this was really fun, but they were kind of pissed that we had East Hyde Park included as a neighborhood because apparently that is not a neighborhood. It's something made up by real estate agents. So, we got some fun feedback. We also got some not nice feedback. You might have anticipated some of that. This was a nice email that I received. Don't screw with our communities, Buster. And then some of the other comments that we got were just about the user experience. We intentionally created a map that you could use on a mobile device and on a iPad, but we were told repeatedly, this is not a very good user interface. And I got the joy of experiencing that firsthand when I helped 60 residents draw maps a couple weeks ago on an iPad. Really hard to design a map where you are selecting points by touching it, but also navigating it by touching it. It's a very hard thing to describe to people, like, don't touch it anymore. So if we think back to like the bias that we saw, and we also think about like socioeconomics of Chicago, who's finding the map via their phone versus on a computer. I think that some of our bias also gets introduced just that way through the interface. So just a quick couple of lessons learned. I think that we have some pretty clear evidence that there's appetite for this type of research, and also, this is a little bit of a proof positive that you can get a lot of responses via this crowdsourced data collection, which is inexpensive for the most part. But there are some limitations to the reach of this online media approach for recruitment. We have some problems with poor UI, user interface that really exacerbate biases. And correcting for those biases is hard and costly, both in terms of time and money. So the survey is still open. We are actively working to amplify the voices of people who live on the south and west sides, and also trying to go to community events with computers so that we can give people the best opportunity to be able to complete the survey. And now we're turning to analysis. So these are just a few of the research questions that we're thinking about, and that we were thinking about when we designed the survey. I like to think of them as looking at variability in terms of sort of geographic space, and then looking at variability among individuals. So, we're interested in how the boundaries that get drawn by residents compare with some administrative boundaries, also how they might suggest there's been change over time. And going back to some of the things that Emily has studied about what neighborhoods really mean, we're interested in if individuals' drawings reflect some of the normative theories about neighborhoods. And then I am particularly interested in thinking about the variation among residents, about who and what places people draw in and out of their neighborhoods, and how people's perceptions of their neighborhoods really vary about thinking about scale and where they live, their proximity to boundaries, things like that. So in the I'll say 20 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes that we have left, I'm going to try and take small bites of these research questions with our preliminary data. So first, in thinking about how what we collected compares to the community area boundaries, we decided to focus our analysis on Hyde Park because we're all here. We all have a relatively, have some idea of what our neighborhood here might look like. And then also we're trying to come up with sort of a process flow. So we thought start with one neighborhood and we'll try to figure out moving forward how to replicate that across. Again, we weren't asking people to draw the community area. We were asking them to draw their neighborhood. So when I say Hyde Park, I don't necessarily, I'll try to make the distinction when I speak about the Hyde Park community area boundaries and residents' conceptions of their neighborhood, whether or not they called it Hyde Park. But we're specifically looking at the responses drawn by the 188 respondents who, when they did that second step after consenting to the survey of dropping a pin, the pin that they dropped fell within the Hyde Park community area boundary. So that's how we're thinking about this subsample. So like technically they live in the Hyde Park community area. That doesn't mean that they think the community area is their neighborhood. Okay, so if we overlap all the shapes that they drew, this is specifically by people who told us that they were trying to draw some approximation of Hyde Park, and it's overlaid with the community area boundary again. You know, the first and most obvious takeaway is that most people, when they were drawing maps, believe that Hyde Park extends well beyond the community area's boundaries, including into Washington Park, in some cases all the way to 94. Most people think that it includes the Midway. And so, you know, we have not a lot of like really clear, hard boundaries in this overlapping, these overlapping geographies that people draw. You know, obviously we have some people who took really liberal conceptions of Hyde Park, you know, and probably in the data cleaning process, people who drew like that far out into the lake, that might suggest that that's a shape that, you know, maybe they were having difficulty with the interface and that should be removed. But yeah, so we are picking up just a lot of variability in perceptions of where, of how people define their neighborhoods. We also looked more specifically at East Hyde Park. Apologies to that respondent who said it's not a place. And we find something somewhat interesting, which is that there is, unlike in Hyde Park where there wasn't very much agreement about like a hard boundary, we do start to see here, that is the train tracks, I believe, right? So people have this understanding that Hyde Park, East Hyde Park is on this side, not on that side. You know, so that's the type of thing that we're going to be looking at increasingly as we go, is like, where are there soft boundaries? Where are there hard boundaries? Where might there be boundaries that, depending on who is doing the drawing, there's a little bit more flexibility? Or if someone is in Woodlawn, like if a white resident is in Woodlawn, do they call it Hyde Park and stretch the boundary? You know, things like that. So that's kind of where we're going. We're also really interested in thinking about this idea of the level of agreement and how, when we back away until we are only focused on sort of the core areas that people agree on, like how much of the city ends up getting mapped there. So this is, it's hard to see on, at this resolution, but this is the same as that green image, but we've graduated the colors to try to reveal like where is there that level of like 100% agreement. So everyone who drew, who lived in the Hyde Park community area and drew their neighborhood agreed on this darkest green. And then you, as you go out, you start to get less and less certainty or agreement about where Hyde Park itself is. I would be very interested to overlay this with a map of the university. I'm sure a certain number of our respondents are students. And so that would be something useful to see. And this is just another way of trying to think about that idea of how much people's perceptions of their neighborhood who live within the Hyde Park community area draw Hyde Park versus, like, include Hyde Park only versus other parts of Chicago. And so, you know, the average drawing from someone in that sample, 76% of the area overlapped with the Hyde Park community area. About 10% was drawn up into Kenwood, about 10% also into Washington Park, and about 10% into Woodlawn. So you have this idea of these kind of expansive boundaries that people are not necessarily adhering to community areas. Well, I shouldn't say expansive boundaries, boundaries that don't perfectly align, or certainly don't align with the community areas. As I will show you, most people actually drew relatively small shapes. So the fact that we see this type of variation in the proportion of overlap shouldn't be conflated, as I just did, with the idea that they drew really, really large shapes, but actually that the shapes that they drew crossed boundaries. Okay, so this is the last analytical piece. So we were interested in exploring some of the variation in perceptions around neighborhood scale, and specifically with this very preliminary data that I didn't clean all that much, so caveats. I was looking at the role of respondent identity and also neighborhood identity, or neighborhood context rather, in shaping perceptions of neighborhood size. So what I mean by that is I took the full data set, so from the 4,000 shape files that we had, and I ran an analysis where I looked at the area of the shapes that people drew in square miles, which in the models that I ran, I logged to address some skew along right tail. And then I looked at how the size of the area of the shape that they drew was predicted by who they were, their self-reported demographics, and then the census tract attributes. So, a little bit replicating some of the problems that we called out at the beginning, which is census tract is not necessarily your local conditions, but just for some shorthand to start with, that was the approach that I took. So this graph is just trying to show the comparison between the shapes that residents drew versus census block groups, census tracts, and community areas. So I've put the interquartile range, the median, and then the 25th and 75th percentile for respondents. And then the median census block group size, the median census tract size, these are all in square miles. And so what we can see is that the median community area is 30 times larger than what the typical respondent draws when they draw their neighborhood. That does include O'Hare and South Deering. If I remove those, which are both more than 10 square miles, it doesn't change all that much. The smallest community area is about 0.58 square miles. That's still larger than 98.5% of all respondent drawings, right? So community areas are way bigger than how people actually, than the neighborhoods that people draw for us. The median census tract is about twice as large as the median drawing that we get. And then we get kind of close to people's actual perceptions when we look at the scale of census block groups. So I ran a quick multi-level model, just trying to understand how these perceptions of neighborhoods got shaped by individual identity and context. We can talk in the Q&A if you want about the decision to run it as a multi-level model, given that I wasn't sampling by people in census tracts, but they are sort of nested within, the respondents are nested within census tracts. You can see the skew of our data. 70% of our respondents are white residents of Chicago. Only 4.5% are Black. So, just being as forthcoming as possible about that and the hill we're trying to climb in terms of not bringing that up to parity, but certainly correcting for some of that bias. We do have a fair amount of missing data in the demographics, both because of those breakoffs and because people could skip. So at least for now, I've just added an indicator that they were missing rather than imputing them, but eventually I will impute those. And then true to a multi-level model, I first was trying to model the variance, so understand how much the difference in perceptions of size of neighborhood varied among people who lived in the same census tract as opposed to people who lived in different census tracts. And we find that about 70% was shared among people in the same census tract. I'm sorry, about 70% of the variance is due to people living in the same census tract. So that suggests that people in a similar context have very different perspectives. Just really quickly, some of my results. So this is modeling just individual identity. The biggest findings here are that the older you are, the smaller the scale of the neighborhood that you draw. This is hard to see because of the scale of the graph, but the longer you live in your neighborhood, you're also significantly more likely to think it's larger, actually. Our missing indicators are significant in some cases. So, that's another case of trying to treat with imputation, probably using the characteristics of their census block group to infer who those respondents are. But as is very common with sort of individual level, multi-level models, really very little of the variance in the model is explained by differences in individuals. So then I added in neighborhood context. I chose somewhat, not entirely randomly, but I realized when I was putting this together that I didn't, include like income. We will redo this, but when we're thinking about the types of neighborhoods that people come from and how that context might shape their perceptions of neighborhood size, we find that the higher level the concentration of Asian residents, the smaller. That might be an indication that some people are thinking about like Chinatown, which is relatively small. And then also the more residents with college degrees in your neighborhood, the smaller that you think your neighborhood is. That might be like bickering among people in Lakeview East and Lakeview West and whatever else about exactly where to draw their neighborhood boundaries. And then as the last phase, I combined these the contextual variables and the individual variables together. And the few things that sort of pop out that are particularly interesting is that once we have explicitly modeled the proportion of non-Hispanic Black in your neighborhood, we actually see that Black residents are significantly more likely to think that their neighborhoods are smaller. And then we also see that renter-occupied housing. So the more renters in your neighborhood, the more likely you are to think that your neighborhood is smaller. So we are going to continue to explore this. It's really very early, very preliminary. But if nothing else, it suggests that not only do respondents draw considerably smaller neighborhoods than community areas, but there's a lot of significant variation that depends both on the identity of the respondent and on their local context. I was supposed to fill in that top one with an actual takeaway, but I didn't. So spared you that one. So yeah, some of our actual takeaways going back are that this crowdsourced data approach has some real potentials for scale, but with the downside that we possibly are compounding our bias. For example, Reddit is well known to be to have a larger male readership. We also went sort of viral in like the Bike Chicago community, which seems to be possibly heavily male. This is the only survey that I've worked on where men make up more respondents than women by a relatively large proportion. It's like 52% men. And then because we let people say if they were non-binary or did not want to respond, it's like 38% women. So that's very uncommon in surveys. When we look at Hyde Park, we see that residents perceive their neighborhoods to extend in all directions, really beyond the Hyde Park community area boundary, suggesting that at least people who live in this area have very different ideas of what the neighborhood, the place that they live in is. And then I already said that one, that respondents draw smaller neighborhoods in a community area with a lot of variation. So, yeah, that is everything. Thank you.
So this is a really cool project and awesome talk, so thank you very much. I'm really curious if you guys have looked into whether the presence of physical boundaries such as train tracks or the lake or the parks affects people's perception and the variation in perception across the population.
Yeah, I think that that's a great question, and definitely something we've talked about in a number of contexts. So where do I want to start? In some ways, the presence of physical boundaries like that, I think are actually really useful validity checks on the quality of some of our data. Like I showed you that we have someone in Hyde Park who drew like way out into the lake. That might suggest that they, were having difficulty navigating the map interface. So on the one hand, we're thinking about those boundaries as useful in cleaning our data. We also are thinking about the work of like Elizabeth Roberto, who tries to model residential segregation and argues that some of the things that are missing in a lot of our classic models, like the dissimilarity index, is that they are influenced by these types of boundaries and barriers that don't get reflected necessarily on census maps. I think the census would argue that they try to do a good job of using real boundaries to demarcate space, but we know that that's not always the case. And yeah, I think when thinking back to like that East Hyde Park drawing where we could see a really concrete boundary, that's one of the things that we're interested in looking at is like when we bring in other dimensions of the context, parks, major roads, things like that. How does that influence what we think we are finding? Go ahead. This one, and then we'll ping to online. Okay.
Oh, thanks, Lydia. That was a great talk. I really learned a lot. I had a question about, I guess, the bigger picture question where it seems like what you said about the community areas being outdated, that makes perfect sense. And I'm wondering how this project sort of influences what we think the community areas should be, because it seems like the neighborhoods that people define for themselves will always be smaller, like what can I walk to or what's across the train tracks or things like that. But the level at which city services are provided at the administrative ownership is probably at the scale is probably going to be much larger all the time. So I'm just wondering how this information would inform a redefinition of community areas that are at an administrative like services scale versus a people's defined neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. I'd be happy if any of my collaborators wanted to respond, but I also I think that one of the arguments when I was giving various comments to the media, and as you saw from one of the emails that we got, some people are really defensive of community areas. And we started by saying like, we're gonna draw a new community area map. And I've backed away from that, one, because I don't think from our data that we necessarily will. I think that what we see is a much more complex picture that really can't be simplified down into the community areas. Two, as I said at the beginning, the community areas are incredibly useful in terms of a constant boundary. And so I think what we're trying to do is create a alternative map of the neighborhoods and possibly of service areas. I'm trying to think if I have anything else to say. But one of the other things that we've been arguing is that part of this mapping process is trying to like give agency to places that go underrepresented and underrecognized, and looking for some degree of consensus around those. So when I was at this neighborhood event or housing event, I had multiple people come up and draw Pocket Town, which I had never heard of, which isn't on the neighborhoods map. But trying to understand like how would the residents of Pocket Town possibly benefit from their neighborhood showing up on a map, and how that might help direct resources there. On the other hand, like, one of the things I've said is that, you know, the near west side includes like over by the United Center all the way to Fulton Market, and like what it means to invest in those parts of the near west side are really different. Like they have very different needs. And so in some ways, I think there are probably some administrative boundaries that could be redrawn so that they better reflect those variations. And, you know, that way we don't claim that investing in Fulton Market is necessarily helping the people who live closer to the United Center. Do you want to go online or you got?
Maybe one question.
Okay.
Andrew Francos, if you want to unmute.
Great. Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can sort of hear you, Andrew.
Huh, okay. All right, so
You get that.
I was wondering
Yeah,
if
you
you
can
ran.
enter it into the chat. You're breaking up a little bit, more than a little
Okay,
bit.
got it. Will do.
Thank you for the presentation, Lydia. I have a couple of questions. So the first one was, if you just give us a little bit more background on what were the inputs to define the community? Whether someone has actually evaluated how far off they are. My understanding was that like these were mostly meant to capture like how people use the city or their neighborhood, which ties into my second question of like, why did you choose to look at perception? I would have thought, or perhaps an additional thing for future work is actually to look at actual use and how that compares using perhaps mobility data that tells you where people go, how long they spend, who they interact with, and so perhaps that can be also complemented.
Yeah, I'm gonna take your second part first, which is that one of the things that, you know, so I use the term perception because that's where my research sits. But we never told people like, tell us your, you know, how you think about your neighborhood. Some other surveys have said, you know, define your neighborhood, which is like where you go and, you know, places that you do and do not travel to. And so we don't know if people were trying to highlight those geographies or not. But I do think that there's a lot of really exciting opportunities for overlap with your work, with Riley's work. You know, these people who are pulling different data sources that can monitor activity spaces, you know, led by some of our colleagues up at Newark, you know, gang areas. I would be really interested to see if people end up drawing some sub neighborhoods that end up aligning with gang neighborhood boundaries or not.
Yeah, so Pocket Town is a gang. It's also a neighborhood, like it's on Google Maps, but yeah, like that is.
Oh, I didn't know who I was talking to. Really gang leader for a
It is a
day.
neighborhood, I think, but yeah, they use the name.
Yeah, so Emily, would you like to say anything about what they were originally,
Oh, the community areas?
yeah, some of the original inputs?
Well, Ernest Burgess and his colleague Vivian Palmer went all around the city, just talking to groups and people and doing all these interviews, but then in the end, they just kind of picked them. I spent time in the library going through their archives and I couldn't find any rhyme or reason to why the boundaries were drawn the way they were, other than here's a railroad, here's a waterway, you know, that kind of thick boundary kind of thing. So yeah, in answer to that question, it's a mystery.
And what's related, has someone evaluated how bad or good these?
Funny, you should ask that.
Bad or good in terms of what?
In terms of, let's say, whatever.
Like
we
capturing
care,
homogeneity or
some
something.
places, like we need to redraw them, and I just
Yeah.
don't understand, like, why are they wrong? Other than, I mean, they were drawn years ago, but other than that, because when you did the
Yeah.
overlap, it actually, I thought was really close.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not terrible.
Because they have an inertia to them, and that's why, you know, some people were pissed off that we were even trying to touch them, you know, because they're sacred now after 100 years, right? So we have that to grapple with.
And we are trying to think about if so the community areas have been used in the creation of this book that was put out like every decade that tries to capture the composition of the community areas. And it's like, this is 35% Ukrainian and 12% Russian, Eastern Russian. And so there are I can't remember the name of that resource now, but that was put out like every decade, I think, over time. And, so I think originally the idea was to try to create some relative homogeneity within the communities, but again, he started from 400 and ended up with 75. So I think, in that process, he probably lost some of the homogeneity that he was looking at. And we do have some projects where we're trying to understand how homogeneous the neighborhoods were back when they were drawn, and then how they are now. Not that homogeneous neighborhoods are necessarily an ideal outcome, or I think increasingly less viewed as an ideal outcome. But yeah, so I think that was also part of it. I go, Amy, and then will you both give me your questions? Amy, and then the young woman in front of, I don't know your name.
Sure, I was just wondering, as far as like South buses, how is it advertised? Do they have the same opportunity to take advantage of this, doing the survey, and say the north side residents? So that's what because I know you mentioned at HS. Thank you for coming from the south side to get more data, but I'm just wondering how that plays into this, because they don't have access to it. How can they take the survey? So for sure gonna get a lot more north side.
Yeah. Okay. What's your question? I'm taking both of them, then I'll respond.
To do that, since we're at 1:30, you
Oh.
can cut it off after this if you want.
Okay, yeah, I'll do your question, and then anyone has additional questions can come up.
Fine.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna preface by saying, like, I'm actually from the southwest side, and like, where I spend the most time in Chicago is actually like where you guys are finding data.
Please take our survey.
But I really appreciate that you guys like asked the question, like, how long have you been living in that neighborhood? Because I think that affects it a lot. And I also think that's really interesting if when you guys are like asking the question, like map your neighborhood. And I was wondering if like a research question that you guys were possibly looking at or like kind of in the back of your head is if you've had the data to where it's like someone's from that neighborhood, like filling out this survey versus like someone else moved into that neighborhood. It's like I, for example, like literally straight boundaries like, for my neighborhood. It's like I lived there, like I grew up there, so like my answer is going to be different than someone that like, just lived there. So like that explains a lot of everything is. And I actually have like 2 suggestions for you if like you're doing like outreach there, but like I can show you.
Okay, that would be great. Yeah, one of the things we're definitely really interested in is how like longtime residents define neighborhoods differently than how newcomers define neighborhoods. I think, like I said, I live in Logan Square. That was one of the most heavily Puerto Rican neighborhoods in Chicago. It is increasingly not that, and thinking about how that definition really changes how you draw the boundaries, I think is super interesting. So that's one thing that we're trying to do. And then also like an interaction with length of time and personal identity, and thinking about how that relates. To your question, Amy, about sort of equal access. So the technical answer is yes, everyone had equal access because this is a survey that's available online. So there's like no strict barrier to entry. But if you think about the ways that we did outreach, like Google ads, okay, those show up on anyone's device who's using Google. So that could reach sort of everybody. But then if you think about some of these other modes of outreach, the newsletters, I think that which alderman office maybe is interested in this. Some aldermen are very differently engaged with their neighborhoods than others. The community organizations, we really tried to target community organizations in the south and west sides, as well as given that we got so much bang for our buck with media, I reached out directly to south and west side media organizations, so like Tribe, Southside Weekly. We didn't get pickup there. So I think there's also a conversation about like, there's a little bit of a triviality to this. And I think, people in places where, they're trying to sort of make it through the day and do the things that they need to do. Like, will they stop and take the time to do the survey? I don't know. And then, with like the newspaper articles that we ended up getting picked up, Crane's Business, Behind a Paywall, Block Club Chicago probably has a very specific readership. We were on Black Voices Chicago. And, that was an intentional push to try to get us in front of the people who are otherwise missing from our survey. But then you come up against, like, it's harder to draw on an iPad, it's harder to draw on a phone. So I think there's also like a technology piece. So we're trying to put our flyers into the library, buy computers in the libraries in the neighborhoods that are less well represented, reaching out to church organizations. So we have lots of things that we are gonna try. Hopefully we'll close the survey by the end of February, but I think the timing of the survey depends a little bit on, the extent to which we feel like we can narrow that gap in terms of response bias.
I think too, a lot of residents like it. A lot of residents on the south side, primarily blacks, because I got some feedback. I was with the survey at NHS, is they're suspicious of something.
Yeah.
What is this? Why are we needing this?
Yeah.
I mean, it's automatically regarded.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, and we also, going all the way back to where we started with the University of Chicago and its role, like, we went into this knowing that in certain communities, the University of Chicago is not necessarily celebrated. And so, we had a lot of conversations about the extent to which we brand as the University of Chicago or not. And a lot of interesting conversations with this advertising firm that we worked with. We're like, that's your sales pitch, that you guys are these official people. Not in certain places, it's not great. So yes, all of that is true. Thank you guys all so much. I will stay around for questions, but thank you.
How many